And now you know you're totally here to see me, and you're not just sitting here because Amon is next. But anyway, I stand between you and beers and everything else. So let's get this shindig on the road and talk a little bit about cost reduction, mitigation, speed. Usually you have those triangles where you get to choose two. Why don't you choose three and start with that? Any guesses? There's a bunch of quizzes during this talk. Any guesses what this is? Password. That in the not too distant past, I found on a production server accessible from the internet. I cannot prove it, but I'm pretty sure that 2001 is the year the password was set. And this is the world that I used to live in, but we can do better. So this is what we're here to share a little bit about what we do at Dx.One. The company you've probably never heard of. If you ever bought a Volkswagen, an Audi commercial vehicle, we know where you live because we are the data processor for Volkswagen's retail partners, meaning we get all the data from the dealerships, who's buying cars, who's bringing their cars to service, and prepare that, make it ready for marketing, for product development. Kind of makes sense to know what kind of people buy what type of cars if you're building new cars every now and then. And we have this wonderful topic of GDPR, DSGVO in German, meaning we process the data and let the rest of the Volkswagen Group know who can you call, who can you send emails to, and that is sort of a big part of what we do. And I run the platform engineering team at Dx.One. My mom tells her friend the boy does something with computers for the last 25 years. I know Sebastian from my time at Google. I worked at AWS. So this whole software cloud infrastructure thing used to be my gig. And now actually switch sides towards the customer side and get to play with all the fun toys that you normally only get to talk about. So how do we get here and why am I here talking about this? To give you a little bit of a little journey, we used that term before, maybe a little bit more towards how we actually did the implementation, a bit less about strategy. I have smarter people talk about that. So really, how to get here? How did we get started at Dx.One with our journey from, not that that password was in our data center, but how do we make that journey? Also talked about quiz. I have a few pictures in there, took them all myself. So if anybody can point out what this is, you get extra points and you get a free beer from me at the party afterwards. Anyone know? You should know. You don't? First Google server, home built. Anyway, I digress. So when I took over this job, there were some unexpected challenges in the team setup that I found, again, coming from a modern environment, working with cloud providers. Suddenly, I'm working with a very diverse team. Normally, diversity is a good thing. We cherish diversity, we encourage it, but diversity also applies to technology skills, applies to maturity levels of what are the team's understandings of what does a secure environment look like. How do you build secure applications? And together with me, we had a bit of a change in leadership, whereas predominantly, as it happens in the automotive industry, people coming from, let's say, mechanical engineering background, going into leadership positions, suddenly we have a team that's coming from financial services, from technology like myself, and we're started to look at like how can we rebuild a few things that we used to take for granted and do differently. And today I'm here to talk about a few things like access to privileged resources, for example. And the compelling event of like why change something, because people tend to not like change in many cases, is, as probably is true for many of you, we needed to get out of a data center. And then the question is always, where do I go from there? Cloud providers are an obvious choice, hyperscalers. We did the same thing, so we're currently started building some initial applications, cloud native on AWS, and now our existing tech stack is moving over from a data center in Berlin to the cloud. Just to set the scene a little bit, this is where we're coming from. Probably not too different from many of you in your day-to-day work. Now, some of the challenges we were facing in the existing environment and why we decided, hey, we want to do this differently going forward is connections everywhere. You have a bunch of servers, you have a bunch of systems in your environment, and they're all connected somehow. Not just between them, people need to access this, and over a period of 15, 20 years of running a data center, you suddenly end up with an environment that is on one side fragmented because everybody seems to be doing their own thing, but then totally connected because over time, this system needed to talk to that system, that person needed to access to that server or database. So you end up with a very traditional data center infrastructure with a traditional perimeter. So of course, there's the firewall around it, VPN access for developers, since we move a lot of data. Obviously, being a data processor, a lot of people working with virtual desktops that sit right next to our database servers and data warehouses just to be able to move data around very quickly. But what you end up on top of that is a bunch of long-lived credentials, growing over time, multiple sources of identity. VPN access is different from database access, is different from access to the system itself. Way too many firewalls with way too many exceptions. And of course, you have a skills gap in the team that is used to running things in your own data center. And that brings with it a question of, do I upskill my team to do something like this that I can just easily outsource to a cloud provider? While we're a data processor, we don't derive business value from being able to run Postgres. It's just not something that brings us value. Frankly, there's other people that can do it better than we can. No takers on this. This is a CM5 connection machine. You've seen it in Jurassic Park. Plays a crucial role in that movie. Anyway, the additional thing that I took over and needed to sort of find a solution for is how do we audit all of this? Because we are dealing with customer data. We have way over 100 million customer records and other types of sensitive information. And in an environment like that, doing auditing by hand and doing, let's say, the traditional compliance approach of here's an Excel sheet, please fill it out and state that you are secure and compliant. It's probably not the best and most efficient way of doing that. So again, this fragmented way of looking at access, credentials, compliance across the different data sources. And then it's a manual process. So it used to be a manual process of just looking at who has access to what, are they supposed to have that access, and still on the other side having to prove to the organization and to external regulators of are we in compliance with what we're supposed to do because we're dealing with customer data. And this is one of the reasons I was brought in, probably seen all that, been in that situation. Go fix it. It's broken, go fix it. And there's a million things you can look at when you're in a situation like that. Where do I start? What do I fix? What can I fix? Probably easier than other things, like culture change on moving a team from that was able to access pretty much any system at any given time because that's what they're used to. That moving that team to, let's say, a modern DevOps platform engineering based approach is probably a long-term goal. So there has to be some lower hanging fruit. And among the many things we're working on, one is rethinking how we access critical resources. Any takers on that? Very few people remember where they were when the world changed. I was at the Apple Worldwide Developer Conference in 2008 when they introduced the way to build applications on the iPhone, completely changed everything. I think this whole zero trust approach in my little world of running IT is a similar fundamental shift, moving away from this traditional sense of I have a secure parameter and then have the soft underbelly within my data center, meaning if I'm within the firewall, I can do whatever I want. And moving from there to an environment where basically every time something or someone accesses another resource, be it a database, be it a server, be it an application, we always tie that to identity. Not just traditionally, meaning you have credentials, you get access, but have that combination of you have credentials, you have access, that's great, but are you allowed to use those credentials in the current environment and at this current time? So really moving away from here's a username password, or here's a username password and token, towards great that you have those, but are you really the person who you claim you are, or the machine that you claim you are? And are you supposed to do what you're doing right now at this point? And can we prove and validate that whatever you did afterwards? And then finally, trust no one, except maybe our identity provider within the Volkswagen group, AWS, because that's our cloud provider of choice. And if you don't trust your cloud provider, maybe you should move to the cloud, and HCP. So we decided to run all of our critical infrastructure from HashiCorp on HashiCloud Cloud Platform, and we're super happy with it. There you go, yes. Are we happy? Good. But what are our tenets? Not tenants, tenets. And those were like the big things that we established, that we were trying to communicate clearly to the team and everybody who works for us. What has changed, or what is changing in regards to access? Access is always temporary. I don't want any passwords that have a year in them where it was a lot younger and prettier and thinner than I am now. But access is always temporary. We don't, wherever possible, there's always exceptions, grant long-lived credentials to either resources or complete environments. That includes database servers, AWS accounts, and so on and so on. We assume that no network is secure. I'm probably preaching to the choir here. This is not something that should shock anyone, but for many people coming from a traditional data center environment, this is a big shift that you're thinking, well, it's my data center. It's super secure. I can treat things that are running in the data center different to what's out there on the big bad internet. We don't make that assumption. We assume that no network is secure. There's always bad people out there, and we treat them accordingly. And as I mentioned, everything that anyone ever does is tied to identity. Identity being virtual machine with an instance profile, if we have machine-to-machine communication, or somebody, a human accessing something, always needs to be validated and assigned to an ID in our identity provider. How we made that jump from here's a username and password to a database server that has all of our information to how can we be maybe a bit more sensible about that. Of course, we had a HashiCorp conference. The two solutions we've implemented, we're working with, is Vault, obvious one. Everybody loves Vault in the sense that we manage all of our privileged credentials in Vault, dynamic whenever possible, so that notion of you don't get a username and password on the database that lives in infinity as long as you are with the company and often beyond. But the moment you connect to a database server, at that time, we create a new username and password. You do your work, we audit your work, and the minute you log off from that server, we delete your credentials. Basically, basic Vault functionality, but together with Boundary that we use to sort of allow people to go from their workspaces on our network or in the VPN to the machines that they need to connect to. So basically, every time anyone wants to access a production resource, this is what we started with. It's actually my recommendation to you. Don't start enforcing zero trust across everything. That's kind of an end goal or journey towards, because somebody talked about developer experience before. You want to make sure that this is something that is accepted by the people who are supposed to use it. Don't be too rigorous and draconic and just say, you're not get to connect to any system anymore, but rather gather some experience, see what works in the organization, what doesn't work, and iterate from there. But that combination of boundary that moves away from this notion of I have to poke a hole through a firewall for an infinite amount of time so somebody can connect to a machine towards the moment you want to connect to that database server because you need to. You connect to that machine, it opens up that connection to that server, to that database that you need, injects dynamic credentials, and by the time you're done, great, we tear down that whole connection, brings just a wide range of benefits for us. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Before I get to that, the one thing to keep in mind is nobody's asking for this. And even the people who do ask for it don't really know why they should. In the term I heard, or the phrase I heard, like if we needed this, we would have done it already. Actually, it was in German for the Germans, like, wenn wir das brauchten, hätte Herr Heuer, den hätten wir das schon. Because this whole idea of zero trust, not just from an end user perspective, but also for access to infrastructure, is something that is very new to very many people, both on the operator side, where, of course, many seasoned engineers or data center people, for them, like it's kind of this weird pride thing that I'm the one who has access to production. I'm very proud of it, and you're not taking that away from me. Yes, I am. But let's talk about this. So make sure that you're working on the change management, you're educating people around like, why are we doing this? What are the benefits? Because actually as a technologist, this shit is really cool. Can you bleep that out? Sorry about that. But making sure that this is not just something, here's the new technology and you have to use it. There is a certain amount of change management for people who are used to working differently to moving over to this. Not necessarily because like they abuse their privileges, but what I like to call like well-meant disasters happen more often than you think. Oh, I thought I dropped the table on the development environment. No, it was the production environment. Sorry, same username. Happens all the time, so be sure of that. Interestingly for me, bigger discussions also happened with security team. Because it is, as I mentioned, a new concept. And remember, first time presenting the what we call firefighter access, we have to our production environments, meaning when somebody needs to access production, which is not something we grant by default, it's always an exception. They have to fill out a ticket, 4 eyes principle, needs to be approved by 2 people. They do their work. We actually use the audit logging, both on AWS and in Boundary, to track what did that person do. So using CloudTrail, using the like SSH recording capabilities in Boundary to really see like they ran these commands, they made these changes to the AWS environment, and afterward we actually look over the commands that the person run and map them towards the NIST 53800 catalog. Did they do something that would breach any controls or make changes to any controls? Example, did somebody turn off encryption for an S3 bucket? Just a simple example. That is so beyond what many security teams are used to and can deal with, in the sense that you need to get your head around this, that the only reaction I got from our security team when we like outlined this process, and I was like super excited, and I'm like, this is more advanced than any of your colleagues can appreciate within the organization. Like their answer was, but yeah, those 4 eyes principle, those are 2 people in your department, so this isn't secure at all. So be prepared for some discussions, a lot of enablement to really let people understand like what is this concept all about, and what changes and what does it bring to the organization. In the sense, from our perspective, there's 3 obvious ones. One is cost reduction, in the sense that we're able to do away with a lot of VPN access, because it used to be that people needed to connect to our environment, to our data center via VPN, because at some point they might need to access some database or work on some server. Same goes for virtual desktops. If we can provision access dynamically and securely and tied to identity, we don't need long-lived working environments within our environment. And actually, the cost reduction for us, fingers crossed, might just be enough to offset the cost we have for the HashiCorp cloud platform anyway. And just from a project scope of not having to deal with like a complete reworking of our network infrastructure in an existing data center, but move things to the cloud and rely on Boundary and Vault to provide secure access, actually significantly reduced our project scope. From a risk mitigation point of view, obviously, what's the benefit? Much simpler firewall rules. Oh my God, just being able to reduce the number of security group roles that you would normally need to make sure that everybody gets from point A to point B as they need to is just something that makes my life a lot easier because there's a lot less to audit. And also just running the infrastructure. For us, that's a benefit of running on HCP, on the cloud environment, because we don't need to run things like Vault ourselves. I mean, I love the product, but if you're running Vault yourself, I have two comments. Either I want to hire you or I think you're insane. So it's just not for the faint of heart to run this kind of critical infrastructure yourself. So being able to, again, outsource that to people who know what they're doing worked well for us, and it can actually put a number to that, what that saved us. And finally, speed. Just being able to take a lot of teams out of the loop when it comes to provisioning access to a new environment, and being able to tie this idea of like who gets to have what kind of access to which environment into our regular deployment processes, meaning as part of our CI/CD pipeline, we roll out the boundary configuration, we create the dynamic credentials in Vault, and it's not a segmented element where we have to work across different teams. So taking out the, for example, the team that used to work on desktop firewall rules, so how does like an end user get to a system, just reduces the amount of effort that team needs to spend on security aspects quite dramatically, as we found out. So in summary, there's some really cool things you can try out and work towards by just rethinking how do people, users, access the environment? What happens, like how do you set up the situation where the metal meets the meat, in the sense that we're moving away from traditional static boundaries, pun intended, to an environment where we basically have a very, very strongly segmented environment where every team has 4 tenants, 4 different environments that have no connectivity in between, but still we're able to have a very manageable, very simple set of firewall rules, for example, that allows them access, because we can centralize things around the boundary infrastructure rather than having to think where are all these different people coming from. And compare that, we wouldn't be in Germany. We Germans tend to see the problems where everyone else sees potential. It's funny because it's true. There are problems. This is a very new concept for many organizations, but it's totally worth it, because from a operational perspective, this removes so many headaches and so many heartaches that you normally have, that when I learned about Boundary the first time 2 years ago-ish, I was really like, I want to use this because this is what I've always wanted, in the sense, how do I work with access to infrastructure? And for the young folks, what's this? Anyone? Ether killer, 220 volts one side, Cat5 on the other side. Last day at work, plug it into a timer and then leave, and ping the external router of your network, and be happy once the pings stop coming back. kidding, but you never know what's going to happen. So this is why I love this cloud computing stuff, because that is one less problem I need to worry about. It's not my biggest one, but you never know. Anyway, thank you guys so much, and we'll talk soon.